Welcome to this webinar on accessibility and structure, key considerations for developers. By structure, we are referring to document structure, particularly ensuring that the visual structure perceived by sighted users is also available programmatically. This means that users of assistive technology such as screen reading software can also perceive the document structure. We're going to be looking at the following WCAG2 success criteria. 1.3.1 focusing on information and relationships, and that essentially means that what you see as structure on the screen is conveyed programmatically to both browsers and users of assistive technology. And success criteria 1.3.2 meaningful sequence, and that just refers to, as we'll look at in more detail later, that refers to the order in which you read content on the screen, and that same order is replicated for users who are reading it via a different means, such as a screen reader. So what do we mean by information and relationships? This is described by the W3C as information, structure, and relationships conveyed through presentation can be programmatically determined or are available in text. So what does this actually mean? In short, it means that if something looks like a heading, it should be a heading. It should use the correct HTML heading element, and that assistive technology and other programs can determine that is a heading regardless of what it visually looks like. The same goes for bulleted lists. If it looks like a bulleted list, it should be marked up using the appropriate HTML. So why is this all important? Let's have a look at a few examples. So a brief background on headings first. As sighted users, headings are useful when skim reading a page for content. We use headings to assist us in this way when reading newspapers, magazines, or websites. Indeed, it is rare that you will read the entire page of a newspaper. You will likely skim it, looking for interesting headlines, and then reading the content below them. We practice this same technique on websites as well. We often go to a website to achieve a particular task, registering an account, logging our meter readings, paying a bill. Using headings makes it easier for users to achieve these tasks efficiently. As sighted users, we typically use the size of text as a clue to what is a heading. So we can see the screenshot on the right hand side here. It's very distinct and easy for me as a sighted user to identify that probably the headings here are prepayment plans, we are here to help, and bills. It's also worth noting that headings have another use beyond benefiting perhaps visually impaired screen read users. They make the page a lot easier to read for people with cognitive or literacy difficulties by breaking up the page. So pages without headings can just be a wall of text to some users. There's very little white space and very little content or structure to break up the page into separate sections, which makes it easier to read. So by using headings, you're benefiting really all users. And of course, there are search engine optimization benefits for headings as well. Search engines typically will place greater emphasis on content marked up as headings, and they will rank it accordingly higher in search results and make it easier for people to search for content that is emphasized by marking it up as a heading. So what are the requirements for headings? Basically, if it looks like a heading, it should be marked up as a heading. And if it is a heading, it should be nested correctly within the markup as well. So let's have a look at a browser and we'll look at some headings on the Eon Energy homepage. Now, I've created a few shortcuts and I'm just going to have a look at some of the headings on the homepage so I can illustrate a point. Now, visually as a sighted user, I can scan up and down this page and it's very obvious to me where there are headings. So here's the ones we looked at earlier. Prepayment plans, we are here to help, and bills. Now what I can do with this toolbar I have installed for Internet Explorer, this is called the Web Accessibility Toolbar. It's freely available to download for Internet Explorer browsers online. And this allows me to highlight the headings on a page, in particular in line on the page. So if I press the structure menu and select headings, it gives me an error message because there's certain inline frames without headings, but if I click OK, it will highlight all of the headings on the page. Now I can see, looking at these components, there are level 2 headings. If I scroll down, there's a level 1 heading there, and there's for some reason a whole batch of empty level 2 headings there as well. And if we scroll up again, there's another level 2 heading. So what I'm looking for here when I actually test this page is that anything that looks like a heading is marked up as a heading. Now something jumps out to me here. There is this get a quote section. Visually that appears to me to be a heading. However, there is no heading tags around it. In actual fact, that's because it's an image, but it can still be marked up as an image as a heading, providing it has suitable alternative text. Now there is a section adjacent which is marked up as a heading, which has very similar text, get a quote now. That's marked up as a heading level 2. So in this case, that would probably suffice. But what I would also look for on the home page particularly, and this comes back to where I said headings need to be nested correctly, there should be a single H1 heading, or preferably a single H1 heading, that describes the overall purpose of each page. Now for a home page that's somewhat different, but I would still expect maybe on the home page the logo to be marked up as a heading level 1. In this case it would have alt text of Eon or Eon Energy, and that would be marked as heading level 1, and all of these other sections would come directly below that. What I would point out here is that these missing headings are going to cause a problem for some screen reader users. A screen reader user can navigate in the same way as a sighted user. We can skim through the page. A screen reader user can actually press the H key on their keyboard and it will cycle through each heading on a page for them, effectively allowing them to skim read in the same way as a sighted user can. Now in this case, they're going to encounter all of these empty headings and it's going to be confusing them as to what the true structure of the page is. So that's just a brief look at headings in line on the page. The few changes I would suggest making there would be this energy supplies at the bottom does not need to be a heading. There does not seem to be any content below it, and it's really confusing users having a heading level 1 at the bottom of the page. If there was content below it, I would suggest it should be a heading level 2. But as it is an empty section, I would just mark that up as a single paragraph, or even remove it until there is content displayed below it, at which point it could then become a heading. So here's just an overall graphic showing what the typical heading structure should be on a website. So this is the Eon Energy homepage. I've just put in a few example headings there. Eon Energy would be the level 1 heading on a page. Products and My Account would both be level 2. And then below products, there might be 2 or 3 sections, each its own subsection with a level 3 heading. And My Account also might have a single section below it, and again with a level 3 heading. So there is a natural hierarchy going from heading level 1 all the way down the tree to whatever heading level you're at on the page. Now it's okay to jump back up. So for instance, in this case, it may be that on the page, reading order, you have Eon Energy, Products, Business and Consumer, and then My Account, in which case it would jump from the heading level 3 of Consumer back up to heading level 2 of My Account. That is absolutely fine going back up the heading levels there, because that just reflects the visual structure and it's quite logical. So that's just a quick look at headings, not only how to mark them up, but using this here, I've just used the HTML heading elements here, H1, H2, H2, H3, and they go all the way down to heading level 6, but also in what order you should nest those. So the key requirements, which I'll emphasize again, if it looks like a heading, it should be marked up as a heading. And if it's marked up as a heading, it should be nested correctly. You should be able to trace it all the way down from a heading level 1 at the top of the page, all the way down to the heading you're at in a progressive and logical sequence. So there's a few other ways you can test for headings. Now, I've just shown you one way where you can use the structure and then headings item within the web accessibility toolbar to highlight all the headings on a page. Another very simple way, and you can do this with various development toolbars, certainly the web accessibility toolbar in IE or the web developer toolbar in Firefox will allow you to do this. And if you disable CSS on a page, that will just remove any of the custom styling that may be present on your site, and it will default to the browser's own level styling. And it should still be quite possible to distinguish all of the headings on a page. So if I scroll down here, Now you will find a few visual oddities like this, that's fine, that's what you would expect if you disable CSS. But here I can see these larger bold texts guaranteed to be cheaper than the average market price. Get a quote now, of course, we just looked at, we know that's a level 2 heading. And all of these other slightly larger bits of text, which are visually distinct as headings, are also actually proper HTML headings on a page. So that's another quick way of verifying that the headings on a page look correct. If I just refresh and get back to the native page here, there's just one more method I want to show you, which is we can easily extract a whole list of the headings on a page by going to Structure and Heading Structure within the Web Accessibility toolbar. And again, we can see these empty level 2 headings appearing here, but we can also get an overview of the structure of the website. Now, again, it really emphasizes the fact there is no heading level 1 on this page. There are a lot of heading level 2s, which is fine. There should be a lot of heading level 2s on a home page, I would expect, but there should still be that level 1 heading and not this energy supplies one at the footer. There should be an Eon Energy one right at the top that acts as the parent heading for all of these level 2 headings. A final method for checking the headings on a page, which I won't be able to demo during this webinar, but I will provide a separate video demonstrating this, is using a screen reader. So a screen reader, if you've watched the Introduction to Accessibility, where we explain this, a screen reader is a bit of software that uses synthesized speech to read out what is on the screen for users who cannot see the screen. And it will describe the page structure to them and allow them to interact and browse that page structure using their keyboard. Now, a screen reader will identify all of the headings on a page, and by pressing the H key, a user can cycle through all the headings on the screen. Now, there is a free open source screen reader called NVDA, that stands for Non-Visual Desktop Access, and that can be used for testing. It works best with the Firefox web browser. I use Internet Explorer with a different screen reader, but NVDA's free screen reader works well with Firefox, and you can just simply load it up on a page, press the H key. Every time you press the H key, it should read out the next heading on a page. So what you would be looking for is, if it looks like a heading on the page, NVDA will read it out as a heading when you're browsing it, pressing the H key. So that's just one final way of testing website headings to make sure they're marked up properly. Okay, the second structural component we're going to look at is lists. Lists are really useful for grouping related content. Like headings, they break up what might otherwise be a wall of text, and they provide some important meta information for screen reader users as well. So by meta information, they might tell a screen reader user where a list starts, where it ends, and how many items are within the list. And that's something you get from a quick glance as a sighted user. You might consider when you're browsing a very long list, it's going to take a while to read through it because you can see it taking up the whole screen. A screen reader user might encounter a list that says entering list 1 of 400 items, in which case they might opt to browse the first few items and skip to the end of the list. But it gives them that option. So that's why lists are important. The requirements for lists are very similar to those of headings. If it looks like a list, mark it up as a list using appropriate HTML. Now, there's 3 essential types of lists. 2 of them are ones that you use in day-to-day development. There's an unordered list and an ordered list. An unordered list is the example we have opposite. It uses the UL element, unordered list element, and that is really for content where the order does not matter. You could rearrange the content and the user would still be able to interact and read that content without having a problem. An ordered list, conversely, is content that does make a difference if you read it in a different order. That would be a list of instructions. Item number 1, first do this. Item number 2, then do this. If you switch those instructions around, it would not make sense to a user to do them in a different order. So that would be an example of an ordered list. So that's how you mark lists up. Of course, you can use CSS to add custom bullets, change styles, change padding, margin, etc. You can even add images as list bullets. So there's a lot you can do, but the important thing is they are still essentially a list, and they will still be described as such for screen reader users and when you disable CSS. So how do you test for them? Well, let's have a look at some examples that I've found as well. So I happen to know that at the bottom of this page, so just going to highlight the section there, we have several lists, and this is fairly typical for a lot of websites. I would always expect to find some navigation lists in the footer of pages. Now it's important that because they look like a list, they should be identified as a list. Now I can use much the same way as I did for headings. I can actually go to the structure menu in the web accessibility toolbar, click on list items, and again we get an error message because there's some empty frames on the page, which is not a problem. And we can see that actually these are marked up. Now if I zoom in, so hopefully you can see what these elements are, you can see it's identified these as all being unordered lists. So the whole item is an unordered list, and each one of these items is marked up as a single list item. And that's repeated for these 3 separate groups of navigation. That's really all I'm looking for. I will look at a list of items and expect them to be marked up as a list. Now, what I might actually suggest is that these items above, we are here to help. Visually, that to me looks like a list of 3 items. So again, I would argue that should be marked up as a list as well. Opposite here we have bills, and again there are 2 items. I would make the same argument. They should be marked up as a list. It is 2 items in a list. It looks like a list, therefore it should be marked up as a list. There is no need to display the bullets. You could remove those with CSS, as I said. But by marking up as a list, you give screen readers important information about the page. So another way of identifying lists, again, we can disable CSS on a page. So if I just do that now, in fact, I'll refresh the page first. It will just get rid of some of the markup that might otherwise confuse us. And if I just go to the CSS button on this toolbar, I go to disable CSS, and I remember that these are way down at the bottom of the page. So I just scroll down, and instantly we have these 3 different menus, navigation blocks, and they are visually distinct here as 3 bulleted lists. So when you disable CSS, the lists will use their default styling of just appearing as bulleted lists, exactly the same as you get in Word, and that just tells me that they are correctly marked up as lists using the appropriate HTML. And these, in this case, these are unordered lists, as we noted. If they were ordered lists, they would default to having 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on, with each list starting afresh at number 1. So that's a very quick look at lists. Again, just to reiterate, these use the markup UL for unordered lists, OL for ordered lists. The third type of list, which I didn't mention, is definition lists, DL, and they are marked up in a slightly different way, because instead of having single list items, each list item is a pair of a definition and a definition term, and they might be used in something like a glossary, where the definition term would be a word, and then the definition would be the description of that word, and each list item consists of that pair. So they're marked in a slightly different way. You don't often see them. In many cases, and certainly for navigation, unordered lists are absolutely fine and what you should be using. So the third and final structural item I really wanted to talk about are tables. Tables are designed for displaying tabular data, as the name suggests. They can convey complex visual relationships programmatically, and they can be very accessible when marked up correctly. So here's one example from the Eon Energy website, just describing some of the ancillary charges that might be added to a bill for various reasons. So there is some important relational information in that page. We can see that the column on the left-hand side is related to the column on the right, and all of the items in the right-hand column are an amount, so they're all related to that heading at the top, and all of the items in the column on the left are items, and they're related to that ancillary charge item at the top of the column. Visually, as a sighted user, we can see that it is for screen reader users and assistive technology users that we make sure the table is marked up properly, such that that relationship information is made available to all users, not just sighted users. So how do we do that? Well, there are requirements for tables. Tabular data, you should always use a data table to convey tabular data. Conversely, you should avoid using tables for layout purposes. It is not forbidden with WCAG2, but it is generally considered as bad practice because it adds unnecessary audio clutter for screen reader users. And in any case, it's easier to use CSS for most layout purposes. You will typically find data tables where there is important relational information to convey, as we looked at, but also where you have graphs or charts which convey a lot of rich visual information. And the only way to provide an alternative for non-sighted users is using a data table, where you can just dump the raw data into a table, and then that can be inspected and explored by somebody who perhaps cannot see the screen. So we've got an example here of how to code up that same data table. Now, this uses the table HTML tag or element, and the key thing is it uses th element, table header element, to identify what is a visual heading, and it uses td to identify table data or just standard data cells, and that creates, on certainly a basic table, that creates the relationship between a heading and the content below that heading. So let's have a look at an example I did identify earlier and we just looked at. So this is the table of ancillary charges. There is actually another table on this page, but we'll look at the ancillary charges page. And there's the table. Now, a very quick way of identifying this is from the tables menu within the web accessibility toolbar. We can simply go to show data tables and ignore that error once again. That gives us a lot of information. That tells us that the key things we are looking for, things that look like a table heading cell, are marked up as table heading cells. It also tells us that all of the table data cells are marked up as table data cells. That's really what we're looking for. If we disable CSS, it doesn't really tell us much about the page. We'll have a look now, but what that does, if I just disable CSS and scroll down, it just shows us the same layout. You can see the markup left there because I just highlighted that, but that would not be there if you just go ahead and disable CSS. The only other way of reliably telling whether a table is marked up correctly is actually using the NVDA screen reader. You can use another screen reader, but NVDA, as I said, is free and open source, so it should be easy for you to get hold of. Now, the keyboard commands to identify and test a table with the NVDA screen reader is very straightforward. If you just download NVDA, and NVDA is non-visual desktop access, if you just search for that, you can easily find a free download for it. If you start it up with Firefox, pointing at the page with the table you want to evaluate, and then start NVDA, if you press T within NVDA, that will cycle through all of the tables on a page, and you will typically hear table 2 rows and 49 columns, or table 15 rows, 2 columns, something like that. And that will help you visually associate the table you're looking at on a page and make sure you've got the right one with NVDA. And then you can simply use the Control and Alt keys held down with the cursor keys, left, right, up and down, and they will traverse the table. They will step up and down through rows and columns and the different cells. So if we go back to this page here and just refresh it, if I start up NVDA and start navigating through this table at the bottom of the page, it will tell me as I enter a new row, it will read out the row heading. Now, there are no row headings here, but what it will do is if I traverse these columns by going left and right, it will read out amount, £1 per copy, bill including VAT. If I arrow to the left, it will read out ancillary charge item, producing and issuing a paper copy bill requested by a customer. So as a sighted user, I can instantly make that visually identify that relationship, but that is still made available to screen reader users. Now, if you had rows down here as well, so row headings, if you arrowed down using NVDA, you would also hear those row headings read out to you. So it's really important to actually try out tables using the NVDA screen reader. They will give you the real test of how you can identify those. Again, just to reiterate that the proper markup for tables, certainly for simple data tables, and by simple I mean ones where there is a single row of headings or a single column of headings. You can have nested headings where you might have 3 nested headings deep above the table, and they go into complex table territory. You can find tutorials for those online, but I could not find any examples on the Eon Energy website, so I'm just covering simple data tables in this instance. And really the key is to use TH elements, table header elements, for if it's a header cell, and then all the rest of the cells should just be TD. And that is enough to create the relationship between the heading and each cell below it. Okay, so that is really the key structural items that I wanted to discuss: headings, lists, and tables, and that will cover the majority of structural issues that you will be able to identify on a website. The second item I wanted to talk about is meaningful sequence. The W3C describes this as when the sequence in which content is presented affects its meaning, a correct reading sequence can be programmatically determined. So it's a very similar description to the information relationship and structure. And all it means is really that if you're reading content on a screen and it requires it to be read in a particular order, for instance, a series of instructions, that sequence is available programmatically. So another program such as a screen reader could also pick up that structure from the page and read it out in the correct order. Now, I did not find an example that failed on the Eon Energy website, which is great, but I have just highlighted where a typical example I find will fail. Now, in this case, here's a fairly standard login form on the website. So if we actually just go and have a look at this live, let me just get the page up now. So this is a fairly standard login website. I'll just zoom in. It's got a couple of input fields and each one is identified with an asterisk, and there is a little key above the form that tells me asterisk means required field, and that's visually positioned above the form, which is useful. I have encountered forms on other websites where the instruction is below the form, and a screen reader user will read through the form not knowing what the meaning of the asterisk is until they get to the end of the form, at which point it tells them, oh, these fields you've just encountered were meant to be mandatory, but by telling them at the end of the form, it is not very useful. So that's a fairly common issue I find. In this case, what I did was not only visually check that this instruction appears above the form, but it programmatically appears above the form as well. Now, there are two ways to test that. So the first one is actually disabling CSS. So again, and this is our fallback method for testing a lot of things, in fact. By disabling CSS, we will view the page essentially in the same order that a screen reader will be viewing it. It's the same order that a screen reader will read through the content of the page. And we can see the same form here. And actually, as I'd hoped, the mandatory field indicator appears above the form, exactly where it should be. You really want to encounter that instruction before you encounter the form. Otherwise, you've no idea what the asterisk means. To be honest, many people will already know what the asterisk means, but the same logic applies to other scenarios. So really, I just wanted to check that that was the case. Now, the other way of evaluating this is using the NVDA screen reader once again. If you just start up the screen reader and start arrowing through the page, it will read content in the order in which it appears in the underlying markup within the HTML, regardless of how it appears visually on the page. And in this case, all I would hope for is, as I'm arrowing through the page, it would read out perhaps business step 1, Eon account details, star mandatory field, and then it would read out star account number input field, star postcode input field. And because I've already heard out that star means a mandatory field, I would be aware that these were both mandatory fields. So that's really the two ways of testing that. Disabling CSS is very easy to do. You do not need any special software except the browser toolbar. Using NVDA is a bit more advanced, but if you do use it for testing, it can give you very useful feedback, and you do not need to know a lot of keyboard shortcuts to use it. In this case, you can just use the arrow down key to test pages using the NVDA screen reader. So that's a very quick roundup of the structural issues that might affect a website and a brief look at the meaningful sequence aspect as well. That's covered off two of the key success criteria. In fact, 1.3.1 is definitely one of the higher profile success criteria, because it's really essential that this structure is made available to all users. Structure really helps people build up a mental picture of a website, makes it much easier for users to browse using whatever software they're using, and it really benefits all users to make sure that that structure is there and programmatically accessible. Like I said, I will provide a separate video demonstrating using the NVDA screen reader to test a table, test for headings, and test for lists, and so on. However, I hope this webinar has been useful in talking about the structural issues that might affect websites, and if you do have any questions or feedback, please do contact your line manager who can pass queries along to us and we can respond at a later date.